I'm very challenged by the title of this session, which is Futures, which should be the opposite of studying the past. But actually I think that not only is every history a contemporary history, because what drives your research is always something coming from here, from the present. But I think that what to me gives sense to the work of digging into the past is to look at the past to transform the future, to make it better. And I think in this process, the historical narrative can bring a sort of added value, if you want, because it is intimately dialectic, and it tries to connect systematically the structural level, so the institutions and the economy and all that level, with the subjective level. So it brings into the history, into the story, it brings people, it brings men and women who did that history itself. And not only their struggle to survive, but only their imagination for the future. If you take this point of view, I think I would suggest that this dialectical approach is often lacking in sociological and politological studies, especially when you take the criminological studies, which tries to link the analysis of the ongoing growth in prison population everywhere in the world and the process of globalization. If you take works like those of Vacan, Garland, De Giorgi, Pavarini, you will find a perfect description, but hopeless description, I find that, of these macro-institutional trends, but actually I cannot see where people are in those descriptions. And as in our roundtable on international perspective on abolition on Wednesday, I argued that the object and strategy of abolitionists should be shaped by the actual situation and subjectivity of those who are imprisoned. I will argue here now that how far this kind of connection between abolitionism and the actual social movements has been important for the origins of abolitionism itself, historically. And when I speak to history in this context, I speak to the 1960s and 70s. Because I think that there you have the origin of what I would call the dialectical abolitionism. Because of course, if you take history, there is so especially the anarchist tradition, but that I would call rather a sort of ideological abolitionism. You want to abolish the penal system and the prison system because you want to abolish the state as such, as an ideological thing. While the kind of tradition in abolitionism we are talking about here, the one which comes from the 60s and 70s, is the abolitionism which comes from a double process, I would argue. The first process is that of the prisoners' movement, which came out especially from the second half of the 60s. And I will go more in depth in this part of the thing. The second half of the process is that which has been labeled the half of the intellectuals, which is that if you take intellectuals like Michel Foucault, also Luc Guzman, Thomas Matisse, Niels Christie, and many other people, you find there that they don't define their role as criminologists or as intellectuals as being everything for explaining what's going on in the prisons or in societies. They always refer to their role as a naft role, because they always refer to the knowledge of people who are directly inside of the prison system, inside of society, and who tries from that perspective to change the condition they're in. So if you take the prisoners' movements of the second half of the 60s, in many countries, you can always see this process. If you take, for instance, the experience of the Krom in Norway and the role which, for instance, Thomas Mathisen or Nils Christie played in that. If you take the Cornet Liga, if you take the GIP in France and the role of Michel Foucault, but you can also mention the radical alternatives to prison in Britain and other groups. You will always find this double process going on. You will always find that there is a tradition before those movements, which can be the tradition of the New Social Defense School from after the Second World War. But that reformist tradition is completely changed by the encounter of these critical criminologists or critical intellectuals with the actual experience of prisoners involved in social mass movements at that time. And that, I will argue, and that's the central point I want to make and discuss with you, trying to be brief in my, first part of the speech, is that is the process which brought to the beginning of penal abolitionism as we conceive it now. So it's not just an intellectual process, and it's not in itself just a sort of social movement, but it's the meeting of these two things which made the difference and broke completely from the reformist tradition of penal reformism. Because there you have the recognition of the subjectivity of people which are inside the system. While in all the reformist tradition, you have a very subtle and precise capacity of making plan for others, basically. And if you go inside the history of the prisoners' movements in the 60s, which I would say, of course, that it is central to the history of penal abolitionism, you have to explain, or we all have to explain, some central features. The first thing is, how could it be that so many prisoners' movements happened in so much different countries, basically at the same time and with the same chronology? And so what you have to explain is, how can it be that you have, in the second half of the 60s, mass revolts in prisons from Sweden to the United States, from Italy to France, and to countries also which were under dictatorship, like Portugal, Spain, Greece. And you have that at the same time without having direct connections between the movements. And that brings us to history of the political culture of this country, a history of what the 1968 movement as such was internationally, but also a social history of the changes in the composition of prison populations in this country. Because you cannot explain things just saying that the militants from the outside were brought into the prison, and this sort of enlightened the minds of the prisoners, of the common prisoners themselves. Because if you actually look at the documents in all this country, you will find that the process of meetings of the militants which were arrested during union strikes or students' demonstrations, etc., do not directly link with the process of politicization of common prisoners. You have indeed some links between the two things, but you also have all the difficulties of militants to refer to persons which came from other political traditions or no political traditions at all, which spoke another social language, if you want to say that. And the meeting between the two things is nothing but natural. It's also a process which was also shaping and reshaping the movement themselves. The other thing you have to explain in this history of the prisoners' movement is how it is that around the half of the 1970s, they were all met with strong repression and they were in many cases ended, both by a process of harsh repression, with many people who died actually during the revolts or the protests, even though these revolts and protests had nothing different from those which had taken place during the previous years. Right? It was the level of repression that changed around 73, 74. And what you also have to take in mind is the role of the reformism in changing the context. In all these countries, especially in Europe, you have a sort of a group of prison reforms around the mid-70s. And that was also a movement to assimilate the prisoners' movement itself. So you have these two things. I don't want to make it long, but I just put the topics there, and I want to discuss with you in the next minute. The other point I want to make is that you always have to take the political cultural difference, the difference in political cultures, into account in this story. And there, especially if you take Europe as an example, you have a massive difference between Southern Europe and Northern Europe. Because like when you get to Northern Europe, you have a tradition of professionalism among people who were involved in the prison staff, which is not there, definitely, in countries like Italy or even France, where you find a sort of subculture which is basically linked with fascist culture, because there is a continuity in the state itself. But also in the prisoners' movement themselves, you find a sort of drive for prisoners' unionization in the Northern European countries, and this is particularly well described in the experience of PROP in Britain, or of the CAP in France, which were basically trying to set up prisoners' union inside the prisons, while on the other side in Southern Europe you have a tradition of extra-parliamentary groups of the New Left trying to connect the struggle from the outside, inside, and therefore you have an analysis of prisoners as a part of the proletariat, of the under-proletariat, and that doesn't bring you to the organization of unions inside the prison, but rather the systematic attempt to link prisoners with the outside, and eventually the support for escapes and that sort of, and revolts and that sort of thing. Finally, I want to point at the role of the European Group for the Study of Crime and Deviancy, which is itself as an object of study, if you want to make this kind of history, because it is one example of a place where eventually the critical analysis of intellectuals and people who worked in the prison system itself would meet the knowledge coming from prisoners themselves. So you don't only have, a theoretical idea of linking the two things, but you actually have organizations in both nationally, locally, and continentally, in the case of Europe, which tries to link the two things. And I would also argue, because it's a reflection I think we all should do, that this kind of level is being a bit loosened. Lost. Sorry, yeah. Loosened is lost during the years in the European group itself, like in many other similar organizations. And this is something I want to say, not to criticize just like that, but because we have a need in this particular historical moment to take back this story, this history, to understand how important it was, and to understand how important it is now if we are to change the things.